This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras. I'm here with my co-host James Majewski. Hello, James.
Hello, co-host Thomas Miras.
And we are here doing our last recording in this living room. We've been recording in this living room for almost 3 years.
All our lives.
And we have, I am moving in 2 days out of this apartment into another apartment. So we will, after that, be recording in another living room, which may look totally different.
Are you addressing the camera, or are you addressing the image of yourself on the screen here?
Am I addressing the image of myself on the screen?
You are. So we're monitoring ourselves
really
this time around.
It's really hard not to look at myself.
You know, we're just trying to up our production game here so that we don't find
this
ourselves recording a whole episode.
Because we recently recorded an episode and found that it stopped recording after the first 5 minutes. So that's what we're a little concerned about. Anyway, so I naturally was talking to the moving image of myself on my computer screen instead of the audience. Sorry about that. Anyway, so yes, momentous occasion. I'm moving. I've been in this apartment for 7 years, been recording in this living room for 3 years. Moving on, bigger and better things. Technically, the living room will be smaller and perhaps inferior, but we'll see. But today we are honoring a listener request. One of our longtime YouTube commenters, Mr. or Mrs. Or Miss or Miss. What's the single version of Mr.? Is there one? I guess not.
I think that's it.
Anyway, TRN/ recommended a film called E Ma Yao, an Indian film with some interesting Catholic aspects to it, and we decided to actually discuss that film along with a couple other films that we watched by this same director because he's quite interesting. And so thank you, TRN/ for the recommendation, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
Yes, boy, do we have the scoop for you, listener. Because, I just think that this is a director that a lot of our listeners are not going to have been familiar with.
That's very true.
I think that I'm excited now to be off the Vatican film list firmly and venturing into sort of unknown, uncharted waters. I was not familiar with this director beforehand. I was not really familiar at all with this burgeoning new wave of cinema in India. And now India has a very established cinematic industry, and in a lot of different places in India.
Right. Well, so it's very regional.
Yeah.
The Indian, there's no like one big Indian film industry, it seems. So,
well, what people will mostly be familiar with is Bollywood.
Right. So Bollywood is like basically could otherwise be called like the Hindi film industry, and it's based on regions and languages. Basically, so there's like the Telugu, Tollywood. Sometimes people will make, other Ollywoods.
Sure.
So this film would, if you're going to do an Ollywood, it would technically come out of Mollywood, which is the Malayalam film industry. And this film industry is based in the region of Kerala, which, as some of you may know, is the region where the majority of India's Catholics live, and the sort of historical Catholic population of India going back to, by tradition, the voyage that St. Thomas the Apostle made to evangelize India. And so there's some very ancient Indian Catholic communities, and it's actually a very complicated religious history that they have because there were these St. Thomas Christians, and then the Portuguese came later on, and they were kind of trying to impose Latin Christianity on the St. Thomas Christians, and then that kind of led to certain schisms where some of them became some of them took on kind of like a Syrian Orthodox tradition because there were some ancient Syrian churches there, and so basically there was some of them are Orthodox. So this director's films are pretty much all the films that I've seen by him are set in Indian Catholic or Orthodox communities, but sometimes it's hard to tell if it's Catholic or Orthodox. Like one of the other movies I watched by him, the priests are wearing vestments that look different, but they're revering some of the same saints, and it's not entirely clear, is this Catholic, is this Orthodox? But
now, who is this director that we're talking about?
The director is Lijo Jose Pellissery, and He started his first feature film came out in 2010, so he's like a pretty young director.
Mm-hmm.
But he's one of the leading figures in what has been described as this Malayalam new wave. And the new wave, this is a term that's been used in music and films in various places and times, you know, the French new wave in like the late 50s and 60s. And so there's this Malayalam new wave, and from what I understand, and this is mostly just from reading about it on Wikipedia, it is some of the distinguishing features of this new movement in the cinema of that region are that it's less superstar based. So this in recent times, the Malayalam film industry has been very dominated by superstars. Those are the people who are sort of deciding what films get made. Now it's moving in a direction that, at least a part of it is moving in a direction that's much more director based. And there's a lot more new actors. There's a lot more realism. There's also differences in subject matter. Like you could say that it's becoming more liberal, not in an ideological sense, but in the sense of like what is breaking conventions of what sorts of things are depicted, whether it means like everyday situations or maybe situations that are a little bit more fraught with, you know, the way that women are depicted, the way that women are allowed to talk in movies, things like that. But what I've also read is that it's very rooted in the Malayalam culture, and like the films are rooted in very specific regions and cities and things like that. And then also like a level of stylistic experimentation and a kind of like an art house sensibility, which I haven't seen any of the other films from this Malayalam new wave besides those of this director, but I've watched, I think, like 5 of his movies, and all of them are, you know, have kind of this sensibility to them to varying degrees. So that's kind of this scene that this guy is a leading figure in. And TRN/ when he requested we watch this movie Ma Yao, he mentioned a Catholic element to it. And I sort of assumed that this director was Catholic. Now I understand that's not actually the case. He said in interviews that he's not really religious, but that he had a Christian upbringing, that he is spiritual, and he believes in a designer, you know, of the universe. So I don't know if that means he was raised Catholic or just some other form of Christianity, but nonetheless, he's making films that are rooted in this region. Like I said, all of his films are sort of set in a Catholic or Orthodox type community. And not only that, but even though religion is in the background of some of his films, not so much a part of the main plot, a number of his films will begin with like an epigraph.
Yeah,
I can never remember the word. They'll begin with like a text, like a quote from scripture. 2 or 3 of his films that I've seen do this. Or his last 2 films that I saw, his most recent 2 films, they begin with just like thank God on the screen at the beginning, just like a thanksgiving to God. And often, you know, somebody will quote scripture in the films at some point. So,
well, this is something that an Indian friend of mine remarked to me once about Indian culture. Now, I don't know where in India his family is from, but one thing he did say is that there is like more of how did he describe it? You know, there's less hang-ups about definitions and things being like clear cut. He described a lot of the trouble that like British missionaries had converting the Hindu people because there was already this kind of flexibility with religion. Right. You know,
now, I've heard this about the Hindu culture. I don't know if that's the case with the ancient Christian, you know.
Sure, but it still might. There still might be cultural similarities that pervade across India, just in terms of being like more spiritual and more less defined. Like, I don't know. I'm speculating here, but it wouldn't surprise me if this director felt the same kind of, well, like, so for instance, this friend that I'm talking about, his father is not Christian, but he has framed pictures of Jesus and Mary in his home.
Right. I mean, I believe Gandhi had a picture of Jesus on his wall.
Right.
Yeah.
So if this director is sort of thanking God, but not feeling the need to define that,
right,
it may have something to do with the culture.
Well, this is a film industry that I know basically nothing about. I mean, even Bollywood, I know basically nothing about. I've only seen like 2 films that can be described as, well, maybe only one Bollywood film, and then maybe one film from like the Telugu like film industry. And most of the Indian films I've seen are also not recent at all. They're like from the 50s and 60s. So it's not only a very different film industry, very different cinematic conventions, but just a very different culture. I mean, I was thinking watching this guy's movies that, in a way, of all the like sort of foreign film industries that I've watched movies from, whether that be Japan or Iran, like in some ways this feels like the most foreign to me, because it's like, maybe it's just because I've been watching, Japanese stuff since I was in like middle school, but like, and they certainly have their own like vocal sounds and their own body language and stuff too. But like, even just like on the level of like body language and these sort of like ambiguous like head bobbles that Indian people do, which can mean like any number of different things, and just like, just the way they communicate, the sense, the cultural sensibilities, the sort of like the taboos, just there's so many different things. Like, and I think that in all of the movies that I've seen by him, there's only like one kiss, even though there's like relationships in all of these movies. So it's like coming from like a very conservative place too. It's just interesting. One of his movies, which I watched, but you didn't, and I didn't like it that much. Truly, one of his more recent movies. It's kind of a sci-fi, strange, surreal thing. That one I read, that has quite a bit of profanity in it compared to the other ones, and I read that was like kind of controversial, and it was taking a lot of heat in India for that. So, like, that's very interesting in itself. Sure. You know what I mean? It's just a very, very, very different society from ours. Very different values.
Yeah. Well, I also haven't, I don't think I've seen a single Bollywood film, although the impression I have is that it's characterized by a kind of kitsch or campiness, a kind of, exaggeration.
A lot of them are musicals. And this is true of some of his earlier films, even though he's Pellissery's earlier films, even though he's not a Bollywood director.
Right.
I think that's part of Indian cinema in general, the musical aspect to it.
Yeah, but here, watching these three films, I was really reminded of Italian neorealism. Basically, there's a closeness to the people on the streets, that feels very almost documentarian. Yeah. It feels very real to life, very naturalized, and yet I also thought neorealism because I also thought about Fellini. Yeah. Because his films also have this heightened quality, sometimes even a fantastic quality that to me was very reminiscent of Fellini. Yeah. No, I mean, there's a certain realism. There's like we mentioned the lack of like superstar, ism in these films, and that definitely comes across. There's some actors that he uses over and over again in his films. But even the actors, when you first are introduced to them, they give the impression almost of being non-actors. That's right. Yeah. And he has cast like there was one of his films, Angamali Diaries, from I think 2015, was one of the big things that film got famous for, was the fact that he cast like 84 or like 86 new actors for that film. But yeah, no, it's very interesting. I mean, the act, it's not just that, but the acting style is it feels like these are real people. It feels like regular people. Right. It's not like super larger than life. They have personalities, but it's understated. Now, one thing that is present in all three of these films, and we haven't introduced to the films that we're talking about yet, but we will, is like a lot of yelling and high tension. Yeah. So this is something that, not knowing a lot about the culture that is being portrayed here, I don't know if that's reflective of the culture more broadly, or if this is a stylistic choice that's being made by the director and the writers. But you have a lot of situations that are frankly really stressful, because you have these grown men getting in each other's faces and really yelling at each other, and a lot of these are in sort of like close-knit village communities, and he deals a lot with like group dynamics, and sort of, I should mention that
according to Wikipedia, in his film industry, he has the nickname of the Master of Chaos because he uses these like big crowd scenes where everything goes crazy, and some of his shooting is kind of spontaneous, and also the way that he shoots, he'll do these long one takes with these very complicated crowd scenes.
It's another thing that made me think of Italian cinema, because it made me think of this sort of Italian stereotype of like quick to fly off the handle or get really emotional, because sometimes you just want to step into the frame and be like, okay, everybody calm down, we can figure this out, you know?
Right. Yeah, so I'll mention, I think I checked out like 6 of his movies. Only 5 of them did I watch in full. So we'll zero in on the 3 that you and I both watched, but I just want to sort of give people a picture of his output, because he's quite varied in his stylistically, but also in his genres. So he's done a number of sort of crime film, neo-noir films, but individually a lot of other genres as well. So his third movie was kind of his breakout. Like his first hit was his third movie called Amen. That's the one movie that I didn't finish because I really didn't like it. It's kind of funny because that's the only one that like where religion is kind of front and center, or at least like a parish community is front and center. And it's a comedy. I found it really corny. I found his treatment of religion to be kind of frivolous, and then that was just sort of at the same time that I was realizing, oh, he's not actually Catholic, so I was like, okay, this makes sense. So I didn't really like that one, and also he just clearly isn't as good a filmmaker at that point in like 2013 or whatever it is. But then in 2015, he has Angamali Diaries, which is like a very well-regarded film that he did. This is kind of like, you mentioned Italians. It's kind of like an Indian Mean Streets in some ways, like Martin Scorsese's early film. It's like a slice of life crime drama. Of the movies that I've seen by him, this is the one that's set in a larger, bustling city rather than in just a small village or sort of like a jungle, or seaside setting. And it's more cheerful, and religion is more just a background element, but that film is very sort of entertaining and like fast moving, and there's all the new actors in it that I mentioned, but also it got well known for this like 11-minute long one take that he did at the end of the film, where it's like this festival for a saint, and they had a crowd of like 100 people, 1,000 people in this festival, and they didn't rehearse the actual parade. They just rehearsed like the acting parts. So they just had to shoot it.
That's awesome.
Like in the parade. I mean, they told people to do the parade, but like they didn't actually rehearse it and coordinate it with the acting. So people are like running through the crowd at various points, and like the cameraman is chasing. That's
fantastic.
And it's just this crazy, it has this sort of like violent conclusion in the midst of this parade with like fireworks going off and sort of chaos.
That sounds great.
It's a very, very entertaining film. And then I don't know if I'll get all the order right, but then so he has Ima Yao, which is the film that our listener requested, and Ima Yao is a much quieter film, and it's about basically about this small Latin Catholic community, this village, and this guy's father dies, and he's trying to like get together a fancy funeral for his father, and then there's a Jikatu, I think, is the follow-up to that, if I'm not mistaken. Jikatu is much more fast-paced, and it is a very, very, very fun movie about an escaped bull that starts rampaging through this village, and all the havoc that it brings out in the lives of these villagers. And then the next one that I watched is Cerulli. Cerulli I didn't love that much. I mean, it was stylistically interesting. It's kind of a surreal sci-fi, weird, esoterically spiritual thing. I just thought it was kind of odd. I didn't think it had much of a point to it. And then his most recent movie, which you watched as well, is I have to read the Indian title. Nanpakal Neratu Mayakam, which is on Netflix. As Like an Afternoon Dream. Yeah. So that's the English translation of the title. Angamali Diaries is also on Netflix. I will mention a lot of these films are pretty easy to find if you're in the US. Some of them, like Imayao, are on YouTube with English subtitles. A couple of them are on Netflix. Jalikatu is on Amazon Prime. Sometimes you have to like make sure you're watching the original Malayalam language version because there's all these different dubs. There's like a Hindi dub of certain movies and stuff. So there's multiple dubs of Jalikatu on Amazon for example. But so yeah, I mean he's got quite a bit of variety, and this most recent film that he's done is also a very low key, quiet film and kind of a surreal, dreamlike drama. So he's done quite a lot of different things. Some of his movies have more action, some of them are very slow, and they all have a sort of art house sensibility to it. And I don't know if you want to jump in at this point.
Well, you gave a synopsis of all the other films, but this most recent film, the premise is basically that a man who's coming back on pilgrimage with his community, they're on their way back to their village, and everybody falls asleep on the bus. He wakes up, tells the bus to stop, goes to this village that's sort of a walk away from the road, and basically just arrives as though he were a man from that village who had gone missing a couple of years ago.
Right.
And he's able to say things that only this man would know, memories that only this man would have.
But he doesn't look like him.
He doesn't look like him.
Freaked out.
Everybody's freaked out. And then, of course, everybody in the bus wakes up and goes, "Where is this guy?" They go to find his name is James. They go to find James, and then the drama unfolds, basically.
Right.
But the three films that we're going to be talking about are Ima Yao, Jalikatu, and then like
an afternoon
dream.
An
afternoon dream.
Say the English title.
I don't know if we want to take these one at a time or maybe do some sort of broad strokes.
Sure.
Talk about all three of them.
Well, let me just say something about his style.
Sure.
Because I think that the through line with all of his movies is that pretty much without exception, they just keep me watching, no matter how slow or action-packed or non-action-packed they are. There's something about his style, and I think it has a lot to do with pacing. I'm not a filmmaker. I'm not an editor. I don't know how to describe this in technical terms, but there's something about the pacing of his films, whether he's doing fast cuts or letting you take in an image or a scene for a longer time. It just sort of keeps you going. And what's interesting about it is it's not done in the way that, a Hollywood entertainment piece would normally do it, which is by sort of like throwing something at you to shock you or to I don't know, just to grab you, some like little bit of like injected energy or drama. I mean, there are moments like that, but somehow it feels more organic and it feels less like, let's do this. Definitely. So that to keep people on the hook.
I had the same impression right from the get-go. The first film I watched was Jalikatu, and that one is immediately captivating.
Right.
I think I may have even been smiling as I was watching this opening montage because it was so masterfully done. But also I was wondering, what is it that's drawing me into this? Is it the fact that this is a quick montage? It's linked up. It's sort of synchronized very specifically with the music.
Right.
This ticking. It's fast cuts, and so I thought, well, maybe that's what's drawing me in. But then, as I watched the rest of the film, as I watched the other two films, that again feel different.
Right.
They're very rhythmically different, tonally different. I began to realize that no, this is just a mark of this director.
Yeah.
And I also am not totally sure what it is. I know it does have to do with the pacing.
Right.
It does have to do with the editing, but pacing is probably the best way to put it because it also has to do with the writing. It's about the way information, the pace at which information is conveyed, where we're spending our time and with whom. Sometimes it's a little sort of side bar with some characters that isn't driving the narrative forward, but it's an interesting sidebar with two sort of side characters that is going to help give more flavor to the world or the events of the story that are unfolding. I think that though I can't name specifically what it is with confidence, I think I can say it's because of craft. I think that when I first started watching Jalikatu, it was like having a breath of fresh air. The word that came to mind was vital. it just felt so alive. The acting and the camera and the writing, everything
Right.
felt so vital and alive with creativity and energy. I just kind of felt like, wow, this must be what it's like to watch a cinematic culture that's not dead.
Yeah.
I think that
Well, do you think because is it a different, it seems like it's a different craft from like the Hollywood craft, even like the good Hollywood craft?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because it seems clear to me that he's taking his cues from Western cinema.
Okay.
He's taking his cues from Hollywood. He's taking his cues from art house cinema in Europe, and this is clearly a student of film.
Right. Yeah.
But it's also clear that he's doing his own thing.
Yeah.
And it's distinctly Indian, but it's also distinctly Pellissery, because there are other similarities that you can track thematically, stylistically across these films.
Right.
And I just have the impression of, an auteur director, an artist who really respects the craft.
Right.
And is a real student of it.
Right.
And I don't know that we really have many of those left in mainstream Western cinema.
Well, that's another of the interesting things, is that these are mainstream films in their region, and he's been successful with a number of them.
So there are these art house gestures, and some of them are more or less esoteric, but they're very accessible.
Yeah.
It's clear that these are films that can appeal to a popular audience. And so it just sort of made me feel nostalgic for a film culture that's really, really vital and alive. And I was just really pleased that not only was that sort of that energy carried through Jikatu beyond that opening exciting montage, which, by the way, I'll definitely recommend to anybody if you're going to just see one of these films. Maybe watch that one, because it just pulls you in right away, and you'll just have a great time. But that same vital energy was present in all three of these films. And if I recommend Jikatu first, it's not because I necessarily liked it the best of the three, but because the other two, I think they are a little quieter, they're less action packed, and maybe Jikatu, because it just moves forward with this this stampeding momentum as this bull is running amok.
Right.
You really don't have time to get hung up on the cultural differences. There is a certain degree of just being aware that I am losing some things in translation, that there's a lot going on in these films that I'm not picking up on because I'm not hip to the cultural.
And some of the subtitles on the English subtitles on Imayao on YouTube are like not even grammatically correct.
Sure.
Always. So the translations might not.
But I'm aware with all of these films that there are things that I'm missing. But I think Jikatu, there's not really a whole lot of time to be dwelling on that.
Right.
And it just pushes forward and you just have a great time. And then by then you can go approach these other films, I think, just a lot more confident and also feeling more sort of familiar with this world.
Totally. Yeah. And if just to say one more thing about his films in general, is that with all of them, without exception, even the ones that I didn't like as much, I really never had any idea what was going to happen next.
Yes.
From like the beginning of the film to the very end.
Yeah.
But this isn't like a twisty director, so it's more that just there's this organic flow, and you just don't know what's going to happen. You know?
And again, I think that has to do with craft. I think that has to do with the writing. I think that has to do with the cinematography, the way it's filmed. I think that it's not pulling cheap tricks to be like, oh my goodness, I never saw that coming.
Right.
It's just keeping you on your feet.
Right.
There's a kind of spontaneity and an originality that is, I think, characteristic of good storytelling. So this is it's just really exciting. It makes me really want to become more acquainted with other Indian directors and what's going on in this scene, because these films they're great. They're really awesome, and I'm I have a lot of hope for the future of cinema watching these films, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like maybe we should start with Jikatu then.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, well, there's one more thing I'll say before we talk about these films a little more specifically is
Sure.
that something that he does really well across these three films is give us a really strong sense of place.
Yes.
So we already talked about how these films are very culturally alive. There's a closeness to the culture in each of these films, to the people, that just makes them unmistakably Indian. It's not just that these are Indian actors and maybe some different costumes, like this is from like the inside out. But also each of these films takes place in a very different kind of locale.
Yes.
So in Jikatu, we're sort of more deep in the jungle. In Imayao, we're at a seaside sort of fishing village.
Yeah.
In like An Afternoon Dream, is that what it's? Yeah.
Yeah.
We're kind of in this rural countryside.
And that one's interesting because that's the only one that doesn't take place in a Catholic community, because they're passing through, they've been on a pilgrimage, these Catholics, but they're passing through the Tamil region.
Yeah.
And it's clear from the images that on people's walls that this is a Hindu area, and that I think probably plays into like sort of the mysterious events that take place in the film,
Right. But with each of these films, the sense of place is also very alive.
Right.
So the environment gives each film a kind of a very strikingly different character.
Yeah.
In addition to the fact that the stories themselves are very different.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So should we start with Jikatu then? Yeah.
Totally.
So Jikatu,
man, this movie's awesome.
Yeah,
this
you
movie
guys
is unhinged.
Yeah. So Jikatu, we mentioned. So you found out what the title means, right?
Yeah, it just refers to a practice in this area of India of basically just getting on a bull and trying to ride it and not get thrown off.
Okay.
This is a time-tested, universal thing. Young men across the world trying to get on bulls and not get thrown off.
Yes. Okay. So Jikatu, like I mentioned, this bull escapes, and
a butcher.
A butcher's bull escapes, and it shows you, and the big picture is, this bull escapes, it wreaks havoc, and it's sort of the movie begins with a quote from the Book of Revelation. In this case, it also ends with a quote. I can't remember what the ending quote was.
I think it was another quote from Revelation,
yes, it was,
but I can't. I can't remember.
But the beginning quote is the bit about Satan being chained up by an angel, but then eventually he is let loose to wreak havoc for a period of time before being restrained again.
Yeah,
and so that's clearly like the connection with the bull. The bull escapes and it's wreaking havoc, but it's not only just wreaking physical havoc, but it is bringing out the worst in everybody, basically. The people themselves who are chasing this bull and trying to catch it and kill it are themselves led into this sort of animalistic frenzy by the end of the film, and it's bringing out rivalries and old grudges and envy and people trying to be the one who gets the bull.
Yeah.
And so it's very much like this Satan rampaging, through the world for a period of time. So the film begins with this montage that you mentioned. It's very stylized. These very short cuts, very rhythmic. There's a sound of a clock ticking. At first people are asleep. There's this rhythmic breathing, this rhythmic waking up, and it takes you through several day cycles in this village to sort of give you a sense of what the normal cycle like in this village is.
And there's a lot of information conveyed.
There's information about different characters, different people's vices and virtues, lust, anger, and the food economy of the town. And there's also a similar opening montage in Angamali Diaries, which shows this city and shows the cycle and the food economy there is sort of central to the story as well. But in this case, the food economy, these are not your vegetarian Indians; these are Catholic Indians who eat meat, apparently. And so,
God bless them.
So where part of the rhythm is this bull being slaughtered every morning, and then the meat being sold in the market, right? And everybody's coming to get the meat every week,
or
I guess every week,
Sure.
So and then one of them escapes,
right? And
then,
so that montage is basically the ticking time bomb of when
right.
this bull is gonna
And from that point on, it's still a fast-paced movie, but you also get a lot more sort of long shots and stuff. So, but it's it's a pretty long opening sequence. It's like, 11 or 12 minutes, I think.
Sure.
Several minutes anyway. So we start out there, and from there, and what do you want to say? What do you want to say? Yeah.
Well, I want to say that clearly, it's clear that the director wants us to think about this in terms of, the devil and vice and all that.
Right.
But it was after watching this film, it was like the very next day I went on a little mini day retreat, and the priest preached a homily where he referenced a story by Flannery O'Connor that also features principally a bull. And I think it's called Greenleaf. But in this, the bull, I think, is meant to be a symbol of divine power and love. And so that got me thinking that this bull symbolically, can just as easily stand in for God's omnipotence, and inability to be controlled, as much as, the sort of the darker parts of nature, but we know that at the end of the day, like, all power in nature is from God, and it all does his will.
Right.
So, as much as these people are contending with a bull that symbolically is sort of set up to represent the devil, it's also a grappling with just
we think about Moby Dick,
right?
So in Moby Dick, which I just read for the first time this year, Captain Ahab, in some way, there's some likening of this whale with God. Like, in striking at this whale, he's trying to strike at, like, the laws of nature, whatever's behind this whale, And so, you could look at it that way. Again, it's compared to the devil in the epigram. But, that's an interesting point, because there's this, like, sort of, especially as the chase becomes more, they keep getting thwarted in their chase, but they become all the more frenzy-driven, like Captain Ahab, to at any cost to catch this bull.
And there's at least one or two moments in the film where they actually have the opportunity to finish this bull,
right?
But it's drawn out because of their hubris,
right?
Because they want to, totally. And one character in particular, who's the butcher's sort of apprentice, he kind of sees this as his opportunity to prove
himself.
Yes. So there's a rivalry with another butcher apprentice. There's a sort of unrequited love with a neighbor's daughter, and then there's also proving himself to the butcher and to the community. And so for him, this becomes personal. And instead of, taking some opportunities to quickly dispatch this
he's
bull.
A fisherman, right? Actually, remember, he's bringing fish to the girl at the beginning. I think that's why he's sort of on the outskirts and an underdog in this community, is because it's all, their community is all about this beef.
Well, he does help the butcher,
right?
And it's also partly his fault. We're given to understand that this bull is is run amok because he's the one who's holding the bull. Right. I think as the butcher is using the sledgehammer. Okay. So anyway, it's fertile territory to contemplate what this bull may represent.
The opening montage also has some other nature images. If you remember, there's like weird little glowworms crawling around in the woods and stuff, and there's references to the role of the beasts in this forest, with another character
and
talking.
The film actually ends with a little epilogue of these cavemen over a dead bull, just losing their minds, that they've killed this bull, but also getting into conflict over like, well, whose bull is this now?
Right.
So it's clear that the director does want to strike at something that's fundamental, something
Right.
very primitive
Right.
about us and our relationship to nature.
Right.
And when you talk about that, you can't escape there being a kind of spiritual commentary or undertone
Right.
to that,
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know how much more I want to say about it that we haven't already said.
Yeah.
We're
doing multiple movies, so
Right.
we
Right.
don't have to talk as in depth as we normally would.
One thing I'll say is that all of these films involve a certain fantastic element, a certain kind of like almost, I would say, supernatural element that gets more pronounced as we move through each film. So we'll
Right.
talk about Jikatu first, and then probably Ima Yao, and then we'll finish with
I think so.
the most recent.
Yeah.
But with each of these, there is that little bit of what I would call the what's the word? The uncanny.
Right.
It's not exactly surreal, but there's something uncanny, and
Right.
here that may not quite be so present, but it becomes clear at the end when so many people have been sort of implicated in this chase. They've sort of roused everyone in the village, but then everyone in the neighboring areas and all the men.
There's like
now,
100 people running through the woods with torches.
I mean, it seems like hundreds
Right,
of men
yeah.
just like yelling like, ah,
Yeah.
they're just like in this mad rage, all piling onto this bull, even after the bull has been killed.
Right.
And
it becomes this like this sweaty, grimy human pyramid, and it's like totally.
It's like the Tower of Babel
Right,
out of
exactly.
human bodies.
That's true,
You know, it's
quite an image.
Totally
Yeah.
horrific, but
Yeah.
also totally, unreal. I just so appreciate it when a director doesn't feel constrained by the limits of an adopted, naturalism or realism
Right.
in their film. Like this film is definitely, I would say, on the whole, a naturalistic, stylistically film. Everything is very believable, and all the responses are very believable, and everything is clearly rooted in a reality, in a psychological reality with all of these characters. But that ending sequence, it's the director really flexing his craft, his creative muscles to basically say, I'm not inhibited by this.
Right.
I can have a Tower of Babel made of writhing, angry male bodies if I want to,
Right. Yeah.
and it really takes something to pull that off, and
Totally.
and he does here. So maybe with that we can talk about Ima Yao.
Yeah, well, one thing I want to mention too that we haven't talked about a through line stylistically is his attention to sound is really interesting. And what I remember with Jikatu is kind of like the rhythmic opening sequence. But then in Ima Yao, it's all about the atmosphere because it's this seaside town and you're constantly like hearing the sea wind and it's like pretty high in the mix. So it really feels like you're in it.
Mm-hmm.
There's the sound of these kind of like fluorescent lights that people have outside their houses that are kind of buzzing and crackling and like there's just so much that puts you. I think that this was the most atmospheric of the three movies for me.
It begins almost in a complete opposite way from Jikatu, because Jikatu begins with this super snappy, super quick montage. With Ima Yao, we have a single shot that simultaneously, for me,
this is during the credits.
It simultaneously evokes both Tarkovsky and Fellini.
Okay.
And probably Bergman as well, all at once. Okay. Because you just have a beach, basically a shore, a seaside. You hear the sound of the waters, and there's a single tree. And I think it's a dead tree. But this made me think about The Sacrifice. And the tree that's featured pretty prominently at the beginning and the end of The Sacrifice by Tarkovsky. Then you begin to hear some music, and it's like, it's what I would associate with like a kind of marching band type music, but it's
have like a dirge.
It's clear it's a funeral procession. It becomes clear.
Yeah.
As it enters the frame.
Procession.
Yes, it's a big funeral procession with all these people, and but the music is a little off. I mean, it sounds off. It sounds like something's out of tune.
Right. Well, it's interesting. That's like a feature of a number of his movies. Is this band music is either in the soundtrack, this sort of like I don't know, this weird. It's like a weird woodwind combination, brass combination. It just sounds kind of like raucous.
And this made me think of the ending of 8.5 with the marching band there, and this sort of failed grand project of this director.
Right.
And then as the procession continues, and yes, it is a dirge, and it's this funeral procession. It's not a marching band. Well, then that made me think about, the Seventh Seal.
Okay.
And then that made me think about the Seventh Seal and the image of the dance macabre of them being led over the hill, and
right, because it's a long
procession.
shot.
Yeah,
that we're seeing
and there's something sort of there's something solemn and sober about it, Yeah. And so I don't know if that's if any of that was intentional, but I think that it's pretty remarkable that in just one single sort of durational, understated shot, all of that's able to be evoked,
Right.
Very, very differently from Jikatu, where, again, a lot of information is delivered in a very different way.
Right.
But here, that opening image I found myself referencing it throughout the film, because at a certain point, the young man, again, this film is about a son who has to arrange for the funeral of his father.
Right.
But at the beginning of the film, we have a conversation between the son and father as they're sort of sharing drinks together and getting a little rowdy. The son basically promises to give him a really spectacular.
The father was talking about, I think it was his grandfather or his own father or his father-in-law, somebody older person's funeral that he had attended that was so magnificent and had the band and all of this stuff.
So
and his son was like, I'm going to do even better for you.
Yeah. So his son promises, this really amazing funeral.
I almost thought that the funeral at the beginning might have been the funeral reference.
Of course.
By the older man, the one that he had attended or something like that.
I don't think so.
No?
I don't think so. I think that what that opening sequence is meant to be is the promise of this funeral promise being fulfilled.
Cool.
He will do it because I saw it at the beginning.
Right.
Okay. But cool. It's the dream. Right. It's the dream. And the reason why I think it's this father's funeral, is because the
fantasy of it.
Yeah, the fantasy of it is because I wish I had had time to watch this a second time just to make sure of this.
Right.
But I think that the broken clarinet is present in both.
Yeah.
So I think that the music is off in that opening
sense.
Sequence because it's
that's a good interpretation. Yeah.
But in any case, as you're watching the film and this young man's plans are not coming to fruition, things begin to fall apart.
Right.
And I guess spoiler alert, by the end of the film, we do not get to see that he's been successful in but you're constantly going back to that initial image, and I think it's kind of ingenious because it's almost as though you are sort of fixated on this possibility, this fantasy in the same way that this main character is, of what could have been.
I want to mention the title. We haven't explained the title of this one yet.
Yes.
Imayao. Imayao, if you look on the subtitled version on YouTube, it translates it as R.I.P., which I think kind of does it a disservice, but that's like they were trying to translate that to a Western audience, I guess. But it's basically, it's like our JMJ, actually, in that it's the first like syllables of their name for Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, but it's a prayer traditionally like whispered into the ear of a dead person.
Wow.
Like when they're like lying in state or whatever.
Wow, that's amazing.
So if you, right after the character dies in this film, you hear them like wailing like Jesus, Mary, and Joseph.
Oh, wow.
The women.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah.
So that's the reference of the title. Yeah.
Well, that was one thing.
Which is why I assumed the director was Catholic at first.
Yeah. Sure. Well, maybe he was raised Catholic.
He might have. He just said Christian, but I don't know.
Sure. And I think it's clear that he's working within and out of a Christian moral sense.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that, say, like a series like Breaking Bad might be like working from within that kind of a moral a moral sense that's alive to certain realities because of its sort of Christian background,
Right.
But one thing that I found myself looking up, trying to figure out was these women mourning, like if it was a cultural thing to just go like super over the
my
top.
gosh, it was like so grating.
I know.
That's another element of sound in that movie. It's just like
great.
the constant
so good.
wailing.
It's
and like
so good.
The wife, like it's like the wife, she's addressing her husband as he's dead for hours, and she's like berating him as he lies there
but
dead.
I think it is clear, not knowing it exactly whether this is a cultural phenomenon. I think it does seem clear within the film itself that this is just a cultural expectation.
Right.
That again, what I know of Indian culture is like of Hindu culture, women throwing themselves on the funeral pyre of their husband. This might be a kind of, devolution of that, which is that the women are expected to stay by the body and just mourn, really.
But there's also the fact that like this husband hasn't been a very good husband and father, and that there's like this grief related to that as well.
Yeah, but I do think it's clear that it's put on, because we get moments where
there's a moment where I think it's the priest comes in, or maybe the medical inspector, one of the two, and then they just immediately quiet down, and then as soon as they finish, it starts back up.
Or
again.
Other characters, like the daughters, having to put it on and then going off right away, or the daughter-in-law, she's in there crying, and then she steps out with her family, and she's totally fine.
It's like the people wailing and playing the flute in that story of Jesus raising the little girl from the dead.
Exactly.
It's like this traditional thing.
So that's what I think it is. And I think that what the mother is doing there by speaking to him is, I think that's probably part of the ritual, is like there's an expectation of somehow involving everybody who comes, in her grief.
But she's like narrating the circumstances of his death, and like it's very interesting. It's just strange to our ears.
It strikes me as a cultural thing.
That makes sense. Yeah.
But what's great about it, from the film, as far as the film is concerned, is that it creates this soundscape that just grates on you.
It does.
And it grates on the characters. Does. And this character, played by the same actor who plays the head butcher in Jikatu.
Yeah, the actor's name is Chambon Venadji, and he is a frequent collaborator and sometimes even co-screenwriter with.
I see. Well,
Pellissery.
I really liked him.
Yes,
I
he's
really
great.
liked him in Jikatu, and I liked him even more in Ima Yao. There's something that's so sympathetic about him, but also, he's like this big burly guy. Right. He can get really angry. He can really throw his weight around. Right. And yet,
but not a typical movie star, even in India.
Oh,
right?
totally, yeah.
Normal looking.
But you really feel for this guy's plight. He kind of strikes you as almost like a sensitive giant, I won't say gentle giant, because he can definitely, be rough, but where was I going with this?
He's someone who clearly has tender feeling towards his father, as we see in their interactions at the beginning of the film.
But, this film, basically all of the events, nothing goes according to plan, and it's all very stressful for him. Right. And then add to that this incessant wailing, just it and that's not the only thing, but there's a lot of sort of factors that are sort of feeding into driving this guy to the edge.
Yeah, well, I think one thing he does really well in both of these films, Jikatu and Ima Yao, is he's very attentive to the way people's like small faults are amplified in these stressful situations. Yes. I mean, some of them might not be small faults, but we see that in Jikatu, right? Like we get a sense of people's characters, and then like that leading to like the various ways in which they all go nuts in the course of the story. That happens here too. I mean, the father himself is kind of a dirtbag. He's off away from his family a lot. We find out that he has like a second family on some island, and later on they come and interrupt the funeral. And that creates the most chaos, because the woman is trying to mourn him. His other woman is. It's comically horrible.
It's amazing,
and he's.
Didn't you tell me that
he's drunk and he's
Didn't you tell me that scene was only shot once, like without rehearsal? Where I
don't remember if it was only shot once, but I read an interview where the director said that he basically kind of let them kind of spontaneously do it, and then he sort of like formed a scene out of what they were spontaneously doing. I see.
Yeah. Master of chaos.
Yeah,
indeed.
yeah, exactly. So, because there's another scene. There's like a bar fight scene where they're like punching each other, and this whole group of guys is jumping on each other and falling downstairs and stuff, and in Angamali Diaries. And he said in that situation too, it was very much like, he was like, well, you can't fake that, so we just had to like let them like feel it out.
Yeah.
And he was like, it's a good thing they're like younger, newer actors and willing to like take risks and not be like so persnickety about their safety. And
right.
stuff.
Nice.
So
yeah, well, you can feel it. It's very visceral as this crowd is getting out of hand, and then this other family shows up, and now people are coming to blows.
Right.
It's very chaotic.
Yeah, and the father, like shortly before he dies, the first thing he does when he arrives in town is to hit some guy with a bottle for harassing him verbally. And so there's this moment of maybe grace where the father is drunk, but he seems to see a saint in the trees, right? Do you remember that? And then he starts singing this song that he remembers from his childhood. It sounds like it was from like maybe a musical religious play that they put on when he was younger or something like that. And then he keels over at that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's you get these faults that people have just get amplified, and the son-in-law is shown to be maybe not the most responsible person. The son, sorry, is not maybe the most responsible person himself. He's trying to be responsible. He makes this outlandish promise to his dad. He doesn't have a lot of money. None of the people in these movies are that well off, and he makes this promise he can't keep. And he's making stupid decisions like, trying to buy a coffin that's way too expensive.
Yeah.
And he wants to get the bishop there for the funeral. That's interesting too, because like a lot of the people in the movies it's in a Catholic background, but they're clearly kind of like cultural Catholics, right? You know? So it's like a sign of prestige. Yeah, we're gonna get the bishop at the funeral. And some of these movies, like Angamali Diaries, it does remind you very much of like the Catholicism among mobsters in like a Scorsese movie or like a Coppola movie.
I see.
Not that these people are like so evil, but there's just this sense that like, oh yeah, we're gonna get these people who are not like practicing Catholics at all, but they really care about getting the bishop to attend their funeral,
right.
Have all the blessings done and stuff.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned this moment before the father dies where he kind of has this vision in the trees. There are a couple of other of these sort of uncanny or supernatural gestures in the film where, first off, the circumstances of his death are very mysterious. Right. And that's part of the story of the film is different people in the village suspecting different things and trying to figure out how he died. But then at a certain point, the gravedigger just keels over and dies.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah, and again, it's just
he dies in the grave he was digging for the guy. So they find him lying in the grave that he was digging for the other guy.
Yes, and at the end of the film, we get this brief kind of epilogue with the gravedigger and his dog and the father and his duck standing on the shore with two other cloaked figures waiting for these boats to come and, presumably... Yes,
and I heard this compared to like a very Seventh Seal,
Ingmar Bergman yes. So there are these, as in Jikatu, there are these kind of fantastic or uncanny elements that are being indicated here. Right. And I think the effect is to sort of draw us to, I think, a more universal implication, a more fundamental thing than just, the tragedy of this son not being able to pull off this funeral. I think that similar to Jikatu, where you really have, a whole community struggling to control this force of nature. Here you have a son basically struggling against death, against the best laid plans of mice and men. He can't fulfill his promise,
and he is trying to fulfill an act of piety, natural piety, even though in this like flawed way.
Right. But this is a deep scandal, I think, to all of us when we realize we just can't do it on our own. Right. And so there is something fundamental, something spiritual. About about this story.
These two films, Jikatu and Ima Yao, they came out next to each other in his filmography, and they feel like they go together pretty well. They're very stylistically different, but they have a very similar kind of pessimistic view of people, especially when they get together in groups, the chaos that emerges.
Well, I don't know about that. There's redeeming things in both films, and then especially in Ima Yao, there are a lot of people in the community who, forgive this father who has died. There's no resentment,
That's true.
There's trying to help. He has a friend who tries to help him make these funeral arrangements,
That's true, but it's clear that he's not like operating with rose-colored glasses or sentimentality at all. I would say not despairing, but there's like a certain pessimism about like these group, interactions. And
maybe pessimism is one way of putting it, or it's just a kind of realism,
right.
like a kind of dealing frankly with the serious problems that are present in human communities.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. The institutional church does appear not in the third movie we're about to discuss, but it does appear briefly in both of these films.
Yeah,
and doesn't come off that great, especially in Ima Yao.
But
I
also
mean, the priests are just portrayed as like kind of frivolous.
Yeah, but also deeply relatable. You know what I mean? Like I don't doubt that he knows exactly the priests that he's referencing.
Right. Well, so these priests like the priest in Ima Yao, our first introduction to him, we see that he's like a big fan of crime novels or mystery novels, and that's sort of like the key to his character because he's coming up with all these theories, and these people are feeding his suspicion that this man was actually murdered, and therefore he won't give him a Christian burial until the investigation had done, which is of course a big driver of like all of the problems.
Sure, but you can understand why he would feel that way. Pellissery goes out of his way to make sure that we can sympathize with this priest because he gives us all of the threads that go together to, from this priest's perspective, make it seem pretty clear, especially if he already has this kind of hang up or
But my impression of him is that he's a little bit indulging himself. He's indulging his own kind of fantasies.
Of course.
Enjoying this process.
Yes. But that doesn't mean we can't also.
Sure.
We just see the weakness, right? So it's clear that I think that what I'm trying to say is that if Pellissery, he doesn't have a sentimental view of the priests in his films or of the church, but I also don't see it as being a malicious one either. Yeah. These characters, they still come across as very human. Flawed, yes, but flawed in a way that's no more or less than anybody else,
Right. No, I agree with that. Yeah, certainly. They just want to have a peace with the rest of the community.
Right.
Now, okay, so this third film, what's the Indian title again? Nanpakal Neratu Mayakam, translated into English on Netflix as Like an Afternoon Dream. This is his most recent film, and seems to have been pretty well received. Now, our listener said that he did not like that one. He said that he goes in a very different direction in that one from his previous films, and he didn't dig it. But let's talk about it.
Yeah. Well, why don't you go first?
Well, I would say, so we mentioned earlier, these people are coming back on a bus ride from a pilgrimage. They stop. This guy gets out. This guy who is not a particularly pleasant fellow, but not in a, I don't know. We're given to understand that he is actually funding this pilgrimage in a big way. Okay.
He pays for the hotel room.
Right.
I think that he's doing it for his wife, who wanted to make this pilgrimage. He's kind of ornery in the way that fathers are.
He's telling the bus driver, he's ordering the bus driver what music to play and what not to play. He's yelling at people to not sing fun songs on the bus. No, he's kind of a grump.
Yeah, he's a grump. Okay. He's a grump.
So he gets off this bus and people think he just went to use the bathroom, and then he disappears into these fields, and there's a village behind them. And like you said, he shows up and starts acting like this other person, and the film goes from there. And it's very strange. But I would say it does go in a slightly different direction. I mean, I think this and Cerulli, which was like the kind of the surrealist sci-fi film that came out previous to this, they both lean more into that like kind of esoteric, like ambiguous spirituality direction. And in both of them there are more non-Christian religious elements than in the previous films by him. I would say, like, because in the village in Cerulli that they go to, there's like some people who are Hindus and there's Catholics, but there's also like hints of Hinduism. There's hints of like animism.
Yeah. Well, the film opens with another kind of montage, not quite as stylized as with Jikatu, but we're at this Catholic pilgrimage site, and there's vendors selling statues of saints, and there's images of Jesus, and so we're immediately sort of immersed in a Catholic world,
right? And
then we're taken out of that.
Right.
Before that, however, we're given two sort of intertitles, just at the beginning.
Yes. Good point.
Explaining these two different areas of India.
Right. Yeah, and that's important.
Yeah. So there's the Talim, right? Or is that
Tamil.
what they Tamil? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that what they speak? I forget.
I forget if it's the region, but it's definitely the language.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so one region is introduced with its own language.
Yes.
And then another region is introduced.
Right.
Again,
so we
with
get
its own
Malayalam language in Kerala, and we get whatever the Tamil language is set in that region, which is more Hindu, and that's where the film mostly takes place.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
there's a big point made of them being in this different area because the guy at the beginning of the film is complaining about the food, and throughout the film they're distrustful of the people on the bus are distrustful of these villagers because they they speak a different language, and who knows if they'll rob us or whatever.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's
so
clear
it shows
that
up the regional differences.
It's clear that there are tensions in both directions.
Right.
But that's part of what I think the whole film is trying to deal with by creating this admittedly fantastic situation where a man basically becomes possessed with the personality of another person that he never knew. That's really the only explanation because...
do you think it could be that the movie is about him having this dream? Because I know some people have read it that way.
Sure. Yeah, perhaps.
But I don't necessarily interpret it that way.
Yeah, I don't interpret it that way either. But yeah, I think the point is the point that I'm trying to make is that of these three films, this is the one that's sort of most leaning into this supernatural or uncanny element,
right?
Because there's really no other way of explaining it than basically that it's a ghost story. Right. This is a ghost story because we get a character who is, for all intents and purposes, possessed by a ghost who doesn't know that he's died or he's been away at all. He goes back to his old life just like nothing had happened. But that's not so much the thing that one gets the impression Pellissery is interested in exploring. Rather, this seems to be the device, the vehicle for exploring this tension between cultures and how people behave when those boundaries are collapsed. Because here we have a personality belonging to one place, and we have him saying very explicitly, I belong here, and sitting down, I belong. I belong. Belonging is a big part of this film. Right. And yet he is in the body and the outward appearance of this other patriarch, basically, of this community. Right. Because it's not just a husband and a father for this family, but really for the whole community, because he's kind of calling the shots and leading the pilgrimage, and at the end when they go back to the bus, he leads them back in procession. So it's he's kind of like the focal point, the site of this reckoning that these two cultural groups have to deal with, because it's this stressor that is revealing, not just the different ways that people behave, whether it's, in a combative and hostile way or in a sort of, a gesture of hospitality. But it also, I think, begins to explore what's important in interpersonal relationships, like how people individually respond to, is it enough to look the part or sound the part or do the things that someone used to do? We get all sorts of different interactions, whether it's the blind mother who seemingly, just kind of accepts this man as her son and almost kind of grieves him anew at the end. We get the shot of her with tears running down her face.
Right.
Or old drinking buddies who kind of take up with him, and go out drinking and having a good time, reminiscing on things.
Yeah.
Or, people who are impatient and don't know that he doesn't like his chutney or something, or there's just little subtle. Yeah. It just seems to me that the
and there's the older man who's very hospitable and patient with the whole situation.
Right. But it just seems to me like this is what the film is trying to sort of investigate, is this idea of belonging, of what are the parts of us that belong to a place.
I was definitely more focused on like trying to figure out like what's going on with this weird supernatural situation.
No, I think that because of course it's never explained to us.
Right.
We get an interesting series of shots of this sort of ghostly presence of this other personality towards the end, sort of standing in these places where we've seen James, the main character, moving and acting, which is why I would describe it as a ghost story. Right. But
what do you make of the whole temple thing? Because that was one of the things that pushed me in a more supernatural direction, is that they talk about him disappearing. I guess it's before the temple starts being built, but the temple being built is an important part of the timeline of the film.
Right.
And, I wonder if that's sort of implicitly supposed to have anything to do with the sort of the more...
I don't know. I mean,
paranormal aspect of the film.
Hindu religion is one that believes in reincarnation, right?
Of course, this is not exactly normal reincarnation,
right? So maybe it's just wires getting crossed,
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think that Pellissery is too over concerned that everything make logical narrative sense. I think that this supernatural, uncanny, fantastic event is just meant to be taken at face value, and now what we're interested in is how do these people deal with that?
I was most moved by the reactions of the two wives.
I know, that's so great.
Just seeing them
it's really
processing
beautiful.
And grieving
the
situation.
Yeah, it's really
you think
beautiful.
about everything that must be, all the confusion and the anguish that situation would bring about.
Right. Yeah. And it's all very convincingly, believably rendered here by Pellissery and by these actors.
The one wife who's hardly speaks in the film because she's just so shocked and doesn't know what to do or what to say.
Yeah, and this is the wife
of the man who had disappeared.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can tell that she's trying to process that in a real way. It feels that her husband has come home.
It's also interesting too because she first sees him when she's taking a nap and she wakes up and he's standing in their living room. So there's the dream thing with that too.
But then there's also the other wife who now is, from what she can tell, her husband is having some kind of a mental breakdown.
Right.
But then there's a sympathy that they both share because they're sort of alert to the pain of one another, something that maybe the daughter isn't so aware of, because she's a little more, she's slower to be sympathetic to these outsiders.
But yeah, I also felt like the daughter was somebody who was suffering and not able to process it properly as a teenager or however old she is, someone who is this guy comes home and starts acting like her dad, and she's likely to be just react in anger or
So I'll just say that even though this film is maybe a little more out there than the other two, it still definitely seems to be of a piece. Like
Yeah.
it still definitely seems to be sticking close to where this director's interests lie, in putting people, individuals, and communities into these really into these situations that are really going to push and challenge and disrupt the status quo. You know,
there's one more major aspect of this film we haven't discussed though, which is sound. You know, we've talked about sound in the other two movies. This film has just something very different with sound, to the point, and it's
Yes,
so
that's
constant
true.
in the film that it's almost like grating, in the sense that like you never get a break from this background noise that's happening.
That's interesting.
So it's basically constantly throughout the movie you are hearing from different sources within the story, radios playing music, songs, and it's all there in the subtitles. All the lyrics are put there in the subtitles, or you're hearing like, I don't know, TV shows or movies in the background. And I think most of these are like in the Tamil language. These are like classic Tamil films or whatever.
That's something that I would be interested in knowing for sure, because that was one of the things that I felt I was losing the cultural reference. It does sort of just become the soundtrack for,
and it's really
all of these
constant,
scenes.
like it's really constant. And again, so you can't really ignore it because it's as a English language viewer, because it's showing the subtitles,
and because
for everything.
a lot of times the text actually has a reference to what's going on in the scene, and then sometimes the actors are interacting with that music. So we get one scene where James is just lip syncing to an entire scene from
and
a
the
film.
old woman is watching the TV constantly, although we only see the actual TV like at the end.
Right.
So what do you think he's doing there with all of this concept? I mean, you could say like in the case of movies and TV, there is that element of like taking on another person's experience vicariously, right? That was the thing that I thought about with the significance of that. But then there's these songs, and what's that all about? Is it just sort of bringing you into this different culture? At the beginning, he even complains about the songs on the bus. He wants to hear Malayalam songs and not Tamil songs.
Right. Well, and again, like I would like to know for sure which, like if there isn't any sort of switching that goes on in terms of language.
Yeah, I think I did read a review on Letterboxd where somebody said like there's a constant like patter of like old Tamil movies or something. But,
but who is this person? And why would they know?
They're from Tamil.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know.
But yeah, I just got the sense that I was missing something here that probably I would need to be Indian to really fully grapple with. But a stab that I might give is that mass media has this tendency to kind of flatten cultural difference. Because we watch the same movies and we listen to the same music. Now,
but don't you think in this case it's doing the opposite? It's accentuating the cultural difference.
I don't know.
But let's take for granted that it is Tamil stuff. Like once they're in the village, like if that's the case, for the sake of argument, wouldn't it be accentuating those cultural differences? Especially because they make a point with him wanting to hear Malayalam music, complaining about the food, all of that stuff at the beginning. But I think there also, at least with the movies or TV, there is also an element of like taking on somebody else's life experiences. You know what I mean? And this sort of like simulation of another person. And those people, these are, potentially old movies. Some of those actors may be dead. I don't know, but
well, it does seem that he is trying to say something about cinema too in all of this,
Right.
So maybe it's something along the lines of cinema having this capacity to sort of transpose personalities, and open things up a bit. I don't know.
And when I watch a movie, I don't question like, how did I get into this experience? Like, who turned this TV on? Like, I don't know.
Right.
Yeah. So this one it's a little bit cryptic.
Yeah.
But
they all are.
But I was never bored.
Yeah. No. And all three of the films are a little bit cryptic. Jikatu is probably the most legible. Ima Yao a little bit less so, and then this one even more. But yeah, even Ima Yao by the end, there's still a lot of space for you to interpret things in different ways. It ends on kind of a well, I don't know what word I want to use, but it's kind of an offbeat ending, you know.
Imayao?
Yeah.
It's interesting. He has this recurring theme of people with two families in a number of his movies, especially in like An Afternoon Dream and Imayao.
Mm-hmm.
His other recurring theme I noticed is failed clarinet players in a number of his movies.
Interesting.
But
Interesting. Well, yeah, I'm really glad that we had this opportunity to be introduced to this guy's body of work.
Yeah.
I'll be excited to sort of track what he does going forward.
Right.
But I also hope that this can serve as a template for us for how to address other directors, you know, similarly, you know, if we think it's appropriate to, you know, just like take a representative selection of their films and just, you know, go into it.
Yeah, and we'll check out more Indian cinema. So thank you, TRN/
definitely
very much for this recommendation. Very interesting to dive into this guy's work. And, you know, like I said, I don't know much about Indian cinema, but I did just see a much more recent, or not a more recent film, but a film that's been more popular in the US called RRR, and this is from the Telugu film industry. Now, RRR was nominated. It was a huge hit last year, like a worldwide hit, and it was nominated for the best foreign film at the Oscars. And this is like a very over-the-top action movie, super long, really, really fun, very, very Hindu, very, very entertaining. And I did find an interview with that director who gave like a little rundown of like the different Indian film subcultures. So I thought, in case for all of us who are interested in maybe learning a little bit more, and because the interviewer was asking like, where should we start, you know, outside of your films and getting into more Indian films. And this is what this director said. I forget his name, but
okay.
He said, if you like more slice of life with a little bit of pepper, great acting, great writing, I would suggest go watch Malayalam films from Kerala. They're fantastic. And if you like more action films, then watch Telugu, Tamil, and Kannada films. If you like more subtle love stories, then watch Hindi films. See, every year we produce 1,000 films, so there's a huge catalog of films from India, which you'd find. So there'd be quite a lot of browsing before you get what you want to watch. So anyway, I know of at least one, I think it's Bollywood, but like from the 50s or early 60s, one film that I know I want to discuss on this podcast at some point. Other than that, I mean, the door is wide open because there's very little that I've actually seen.
Cool.
So I'm certainly open to suggestions from you all listeners, or even outside of Indian cinema. Again, we're very open to taking suggestions. We can't guarantee that we'll discuss every film that's suggested, but I certainly will check them out and see if we want to discuss them.
If you think that there's a director, especially of Catholic interest, who's very excellent, we definitely want to hear it.
Yeah.
But I'm also excited to get into different world cinema directors, you know, so I would love to spend some time with Persian, Iranian cinema.
Yes,
you know, maybe hit
a
Abbas Kiarostami in the same way, you know. But this has been great.
Great. Okay. Well, I think our next episode we're going to be doing the John Huston adaptation of Flannery O'Connor's novel Wise Blood. So that'll be that'll be a fun one. We've been wanting to do this for a while. So tune in next time for that one. I have to move apartments in 2 days. I don't know when our next recording will be, but hopefully not too long. Hopefully we'll be able to get back on a normal schedule here. Everybody, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.